excited to go over FRQ2 and FRQ4 with you, give you some hints on how to attack those questions. The reason this is important is because the AP exam more than likely is going to be just written FRQs. So after spring break, we'll know more about the test, and then we'll probably spend the week after spring break and to whenever the test is just reviewing over those first 3 units. I think the first 3 units, from what I understand, that's what the test will be focused on, because that's the unit that we left off at, basically, that most classes would have left off at if they were like us and started in January, get through unit 3. So that's what they're going to make the test. They're going to leave out 4 and 5 is my understanding, but I'll know more about that later. So FRQ2 is always some sort of data analysis. So, looking at your book on page 384, you see the graph there of the approval rating of President Obama. And it asks you several questions about that. So it asks you to identify the information in the graph, describe a trend in public opinion of job approval for President Obama. So you're describing a trend. Draw a conclusion about when President Obama would have had his best chance of moving his agenda forward. And then finally, explain why presidential approval ratings can fluctuate. So anytime you get these questions, you need to take your time and identify, what is the question asking you. And I know in FRQs 1, 2, and 3, usually they set it up with A, B, C, and D, or A, B, and C. And it's perfectly fine to write it in that structure. Put A, write your 1 or 2 sentences to answer part A. Put part B, and then answer that part. So you can structure it just like they set the question up. And I'll show you that in my sample answers coming up. So you want to identify, what are they asking us to do? So if you look, make sure you are specific. You're identifying the information conveyed in the graph. You're describing a trend, drawing a conclusion, explaining why. So those are key words there to look at, so that you know exactly what you need to write about. And then go through and say, all right, well, how many things are they asking me to do? This is a 4-point question. So if you answer each of the things that they want you to answer, then this is worth 4 points. So, if you're unsure about one of the parts, well, just do the parts that you can do, right? If you can get 3 out of 4 points, that's better than just skipping the question. Even if you can only do part A or part B, at least get as many points as you can. Don't just skip over it. At least try. Give yourself a chance to get those points. So we're going to go part by part here. Part A, identify the information conveyed in the graph. So that word conveyed is pretty important, because you don't want to just look at the title of the graph and put that down. All right, that's not going to be enough. So conveyed, what type of message is the graph showing us? What is the graph showing us aside from just the title? Yes, it's about job approval for President Obama, but what else is going on in the graph? It's not just 1 year or 2 years. It's basically all the years he was in office. So you want to be detailed as much as possible about what's going on in the graph or the chart, whatever it is they're showing you in FRQ number 2. So my sample answer here, the graph shows the changes in the job approval rating of President Obama during his 2 terms or 8 years in office. So I'm trying to be as detailed as possible. That's what the graph is showing me. Notice just 1 sentence. So some of these you can get away with just 1 sentence if you are specific enough in that sentence and put enough details into that sentence. All right, so we got that point. So part B, describe a trend And trends have to do with change over time. What's happening over a certain amount of time. So we want to describe a trend. It doesn't have to be from the beginning to end. You could focus on a certain part of the graph. You just have to identify what you're talking about and be specific once again. Naraya.
Hey.
Hey. What you doing?
Nothing.
You just wake up too? You just missed Cam. Did you just wake up?
No, I just came from the hospital.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Why? What's wrong?
Hold on. I'm gonna show you.
Oh, hold on one second. I was recording. Let me pause the recording. You went to the hospital?
Yeah.
Back to action here. All right, so we're just going over part B. So here, describe a trend. So that's what we want to do. All right, so here I just really, you could just focus on, one thing that all presidents typically have in common with their job approval is that usually their first year or so, they have pretty high job approval, but over time it goes down for various reasons. Obviously, if you win an election, that means you're pretty popular at that time. So the same thing here with Obama. President Obama started with a high approval rating when he was first elected, and then over his first term, so notice I'm being specific, I'm looking at just his first term, his approval rating declined. But then it rose again around the time of his reelection. So remember, he would be reelected around 2012. Okay, so from 2009 to 2012 was when he was reelected, and then he finished out his second term with the same kind of pattern. So you could talk about in his second term, his approval rating had gone up by the time he was reelected. Then it dipped again, but he was able to finish his second term with an increase in his job approval rating. So by the time he was done being president, it had gone back up to over 50% job approval rating. So like I said, you could try to describe the whole thing, or you could just look at, half of it. It just says to describe a trend. So that's one of the trends that happens. You start out with a high approval rating, and usually it's going to decline for various reasons, which we'll talk about later. All right, part C. All right, draw a conclusion. So using the graph, we want to think about what conclusion can we make about when President Obama would have had his best chance of moving his agenda forward. And that agenda means a policy agenda, his ideas, the laws he wants to see Congress pass. Now he's a pretty good president to do because he has, legislation that uses his name, Obamacare. So if you know anything about Obamacare, you know that was passed early on when he was first elected because he was very popular. He just won the election. His job approval rating was pretty high in that, usually we call it the honeymoon period, those first 100 days right after being elected or reelected. So that's when he had the best chance to pass what we call Obamacare. So here, presidents have the best chance of moving their policy agendas forward when their approval is high, because it puts pressure on Congress to pass their policies. So notice there you've got to be detailed. Notice I say don't jump to conclusions. You have to draw the conclusion. meaning you have to look at evidence, look at trends, and then make the conclusion. Don't jump to the conclusion without explaining where that conclusion came from. So notice I put the stuff here about putting pressure on Congress, because if I'm the president and I'm popular, I can use that. I can use the bully pulpit to put pressure on Congress to pass those laws, those policies that I want to see implemented. So for President Obama, he would have had his best chance to get his policies like Obamacare through around 2009, when his approval rating was at its highest point. So it was in the 60s, which is very high for job approval ratings. So that means he was at his most popular, I guess you could say. People thought he would make a great president. Even after his reelection, where it kind of spikes there right after he was reelected, back over 50%. He would have a good opportunity at that point to pressure Congress to pass some of his policy ideas. So moving on to part D. So now this is more in general. You see all the fluctuations. It goes down, it goes up, it goes down. So explain why presidential approval ratings can fluctuate. So what would be the causes of these ups and downs when it comes to presidential approval? Even now in the current climate, presidential approval for President Trump. Early on with this coronavirus stuff, people weren't sure he was doing such a good job, but then it went back up. People saw that he was starting to make decisions, implement plans, encourage Congress to pass legislation. So people started to, his approval rating increased during this time because of how they saw his change and how he was handling things. So that's a good example of why in real life, we're kind of living this in real time. Presidential approval can fluctuate. But other reasons you could have gotten from the readings, make sure you're reading your book. Presidential job approval can fluctuate for many reasons. Some of these include wars and other major events like the coronavirus, changes in the economy, whether it goes up or down, scandals, so when they get caught doing things, or even something like impeachment, and the success and failure of the president's policy agenda. So going back to President Obama, once Obamacare was implemented, a lot of people started to criticize the policy. So he was popular enough, his approval rating was high enough to get it implemented. But then, what came after that? The idea was it a success? Were there glitches? Were there problems? So that could be something that causes the approval rating to fall. So keep all those things in mind. Now, hopefully you're not just going to copy what I've got. So make sure you think about, you can think about my answers. That's why I shared them. But put them in your own words. Make sure you understand what you're writing about. So that's FRQ number 2. And number 2 is always, like I said, going to give you some sort of visual to look at and to write about. FRQ 4, that's the big one. That is the argumentative essay. This is the one that most people are afraid of. This is the one where it's not going to give you an A, B, C, or D. You've got to actually write an essay. So keep that in mind. FRQ 4s, argumentative essays, they expect you to write a flowing essay, but you can easily structure it, and I'm going to show you how to structure it. So even though you're not going to put A, B, C, and D, you can structure it in a particular order, because the order is always going to be the same for these FRQ4s. So here, it says develop an argument that explains whether public opinion polling during an election has a positive or negative effect on American political life. So taking that statement it says articulate a defensible claim or thesis that responds to the prompt and establishes a line of reasoning. So that's the first thing you want to think about. What is your thesis going to be? Establish a line of reasoning. Then you're going to pick out two, I've kind of lumped these together, two pieces of evidence. You can choose, one of them has to come from the three choices that they've given you: Federalist 10, Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution. For me, I would stick with the evidence that they give you for both pieces of evidence, because your second piece of evidence can once again come from those three, or you can try to think of something else. And to me, the danger is, well, what if you can't think of anything else? So try to stick with, since they're going to give you at least two already, and here they've given you three, you might as well try to work with what they give you, because you know that what they give you is gonna, it's gonna work anyway, because that's why they're giving it to you, because they know that you can use it. So I would take both pieces of evidence from what they offer you. And then not only do you have to use the evidence and explain why it's relevant, you have to explain how does it support your claim or your thesis. And then finally, the last thing they want you to do is to always respond to the alternate perspective, to the counter argument to whatever you're doing, whatever you're writing about. So if I'm arguing that polling is positive, then somewhere in the essay, usually I would do it at the end, you want to acknowledge why do some people claim that it's negative. Okay, so they want you to see both sides of the argument. So there's a lot there, okay, but divide it into parts. Notice how I've kind of chunked it into these parts. So when you look at, you know, how many points is this worth? It's worth 6 points, right? 6 points. Excuse me. All right, so it's worth 6 points. So how many points can you get out of it? It's okay if you can just use one piece of evidence and explain it well and give a counter argument. Well, that's at least 4 points. So try to at least get 4 points in there. Or maybe, you know, you don't know how to do the counter argument. So maybe you just stick with your argument. Well, that's at least 5 points. So get as many points as you can. Okay, don't just skip any questions. So let's break it down. Now in this one, I'm not sharing with you any answers. I did that for you on the first one. So this one, I really want you to come up with your own ideas, but I'm going to give you a lot of hints of what to look for. So let's think about the thesis. So your thesis you could do easily in one sentence. And basically what you're trying to do here is to summarize the entire essay in one sentence. And this can be in any particular order. So you would start with your claim. So using the prompt, positive or negative, start with that. What is your argument going to be? You know, and don't use I, all right, leave out the I's. So whatever you say, we know it's coming from you, so you don't have to say I. So public opinion polling during an election has a positive effect on American political life. So you start out that way because, so this is where you come in with your reasoning, and you want to give both your reasonings. So you want to think about, you know, what evidence am I going to use? Because this and this. Okay, so you want to lay out your reasonings. Although, so you can stick this in there somewhere in that sentence. So it's kind of a long sentence. You might want to feel more comfortable putting it into 2 or 3 sentences. Although, you know, some people think polling is negative because this. Okay, so you want to touch on all of those things in your thesis. You want to establish a line of reasoning. And that's going to help lead you through the rest of the essay because you've already laid it out in those first couple of sentences. All right. The hardest part's probably going to be this, because you may or may not know or remember, you should know some things, anything about these options that they give you to use for evidence. So once again, you're looking at 4 sentences. you're going to talk about one piece of evidence. So in Federalist Paper 10, blah, blah, blah. Point out, James Madison said this. And then you would explain how does it link back to polling and its effect on elections. So you would include a sentence that does the explanation. And then once you're done talking about that piece of evidence, your next paragraph could be in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson says, blah, blah, blah. And then explain how that links back to polling and elections, whether it be positive or negative. Okay, so here you're going to have to do some thinking. You might have to go back in and look at those documents again. The Constitution, as an example, you could go anywhere with that because the Constitution is everything from the preamble through all of the amendments. So you could use anything in there. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So looking at each piece of evidence, just to kind of give you a refresher, Federalist Paper 10, written by James Madison, discussed what a faction was and how factions are dangerous, especially majority factions that can abuse minority groups because of their sheer numbers. And he was arguing that a large republic was best suited to control for those potential abuses by factions. And just thinking about some of the quotes, he talked about how one of the remedies for a faction was to take away its liberty or its freedom, but that was dangerous. You don't want to do that because part of our democracy is having the freedom to express ourselves. And maybe you could relate that back to public opinion polls. So go back and take a look at that document, very important. Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, 1776, explained the rights of man, the natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, explained how governments were created to protect our rights. He went on to talk about how, just like in the social contract from the Enlightenment, if the government doesn't protect those rights, we have a duty to implement a new government, which is what we were doing with the British there. So in the context of the revolution against the British, you've got to keep that in mind when you're talking about the Declaration of Independence. And finally, like I said, the Constitution covers a wide range of stuff. You could talk about Congress, House and Senate. You could talk about their elections. The House, is elected every 2 years. The Senate's elected every 6 years. Does that have anything to do with polling? I don't know. Maybe you think about that. The president elected every 4 years, but remember they're elected by indirectly from the Electoral College. So how could you include something about the Electoral College in there if you wanted to use that as an example? Don't forget your freedoms. The First Amendment, freedom of speech. Can you connect that to public opinion polling or any of the other amendments? So the Constitution allows you to use a wide range of examples since they're offering you that as a potential piece of evidence. You just want to be specific. What part of the Constitution are you using? Article 1, if you're talking about Congress. Article 2, if you're talking about the president or even the Electoral College. Are you talking about one of the amendments like the First Amendment? So keep that in mind for your evidence. All right, and then finally, you would finish it off by taking a brief look at the counter to what you're talking about. So I guess if I'm writing something about the positive effects of polling, then you would finish by acknowledging that there is another alternative point of view that thinks that polling is negative. And then what you want to do is you either want to refute that, explain why they're wrong. First of all, explain their point of view and then talk about why they might be wrong. Or you can concede, which is explain why it makes sense. And to me, that might be the easiest one to go with. Just acknowledge it. Say there is an alternative point of view that thinks polling is negative. They think that polling, what's something you could say that would be negative? Polling causes this bandwagoning effect where people look at the polling and they just go with whatever's popular in the polls, and that's not really how our democracy should work. You should be making your own decisions, not being influenced by polling data. So you could say something like that, explaining the other point of view. Okay, so FRQ4s are tough. They're meant to be tough, but remember you're trying to get college credit, so keep that in mind. So it's got to be a little tough. So like I said, I'll have more information about the test hopefully by tomorrow, and then I'll let you guys know what's going to go on with the test. But a couple more days, try to get some work done. We've got spring break next week, so I won't be posting any new assignments next week, so you can just relax. And you guys, as always, take care of yourself. Okay.